Hi, welcome back. So for this week of Surviving Semester 1, I've been asked to do a little bit more on dissertations. So in the previous video, you guys might have seen that I gave you some advice on how to plan dissertations, how to get your ideas from a spider diagram to something that you can really walk through with your supervisor when you have that first meeting. This week, I'm going to go through how to write introductions. Introductions to dissertations can be super daunting. They're way longer than the sort of introductions you're really going to be doing for a 2,000 word essay, which is to be expected. So how can you not waffle? At this stage, really, an introduction is going to tell you where you're going, and it's as much about you figuring out what you're going to be writing for the next few months as it is about telling the reader. This introduction will change. It will be the last thing you go back and redraft when you're ready to hand in your dissertation. You're helping yourself out a lot by writing an introduction now, because it's telling you exactly what you're going to be doing. Okay, so let's have a look at the overall structure of a dissertation. I'm really happy to put mine up on the board for you, so if you have a look at the screen somewhere up here, you guys should be able to see this now. You can see the contents page. I had a 12,000 word dissertation, and I broke it down so that I had a main introduction and a main conclusion. Within each chapter that I had, and they were thematic, I had a mini introduction and a mini conclusion. You might remember from the last video, and I'll pop the link below, that I said you can think about your dissertation chapters like little 2,000 word essays. Might not sound so little now, but it will when you're at the other side, trust me. So I had mini introductions and mini conclusions to really focus each chapter, and the introduction for the main dissertation was to really cover the breadth and set out what the key issues are in a way that you might not have to do really when you're doing an essay on a module, when it's not as research focused. So you can see that I went for six main chapters and then a conclusion, so everything I did was about 1,500 words. The dissertation was 12,000 and a little bit overall, and then I had my illustrations at the back and my bibliography, which you can see on there too, and they're little bits of fine-tuning you can do at the very end. Okay, so let's go ahead and have a little look at how to write an introduction. Now, if you had a look at the last video, you might remember that I advised for you guys to go and have a look at dissertation repositories. So I recommended Final Chapter, which is the one that we use at my institution, but there are plenty of other ones out there, so you can have a look at completed dissertations that did well. What I did when I started out, I got a history dissertation on something completely irrelevant, and I read it just to see what every paragraph in the introduction did. So yes, you have a big, word count for your introduction, but you still need to make sure that every paragraph does a job. And here's how my paragraphs work for me. So the first paragraph of my introduction is about catching the reader's attention. Hopefully you've picked a topic that you find super interesting. If you haven't, you're probably doing your dissertation wrong at this point. You should at least enjoy it starting out, even though it can be a bit stressful going forward. So a nice kind of hook sentence to draw the reader in and get the reader interested is a good way to start. So for me, I did a dissertation on Shakespeare's Macbeth, Euripides' Medea, comparing ancient and early modern drama, and I started with witchcraft has survived the ages within the human imagination. Boom. Something to just reel the reader in. And you can see that I've covered the breadth of my time period, and I mentioned time periods last time, by tracing the theme from Homer to tragedy, and then to kind of Shakespeare too. So I've given a little timeline, and I've given the reader a flavour of what's to come. It's something really that you don't have space to do when you're writing those 3 and 4 sentence introductions to an essay, but when you're doing a dissertation, you're kind of making the case that the research is important and interesting, and you're asserting the value of what you're doing right away. So that's paragraph 1. The second paragraph sets out my aims, and you can be really upfront about it. Now, I mentioned before that not every department likes you to say I, but if you're uncomfortable with that, go with this dissertation aims to explore. At this stage, I kind of had all of these paragraph starters as little subheadings that I'd got from elsewhere, and used it as a pro forma to think, well, what am I actually really doing in my dissertation? So I set this up really clearly with, this dissertation aims to explore how witchcraft is used within Euripides' Medea and Shakespeare's Macbeth, to inspire a sense of dread by interacting with contemporary characterizations of witches, be they literary or political. Okay? And then I've addressed one of the key issues, although neither of the tragedians in question labels their supernatural characters as witches. So if you have any caveats, or you have anything that could be used to pull apart your argument, that's something to set up in the introduction with a nice although. So although some may suggest that this, I will be inquiring into this on the grounds that, okay? So deal with any kind of weak points in your argument and do that, kind of up front. And your second paragraph, paragraph 2, is setting out your main aims and objectives for the work overall. Okay, so you've started big, you've got a hook, you've got an overview. Now paragraph 3 should be doing something like this, and that is setting up the kind of evidence you're going to be looking at. Now, I know that this channel is really for classicists and ancient historians. I've had comments from Egyptologists too. And this will be different depending on what kind of dissertation you're writing. If you're an ancient historian or an Egyptologist, it's going to be about looking at a particular site perhaps that you're going to be inquiring into. It might be looking at different artifacts and acknowledging what artifacts you don't have, what can't you examine, what would be really useful but isn't available. Is there anything that's compromised this evidence? For a literature person such as myself, I went in with the particulars of the texts I was looking at, because as I said in the last video, it's all about focusing in on evidence. So whereas I've got thematic chapters, you might be advised, if you're an ancient historian or an Egyptologist, to organise your chapters according to the evidence available, drawing the conclusions you can and bringing the argument together in a conclusion. And that's something that only your supervisor can really advise you on. So let's have a look how I did the third paragraph. So for Euripides, the association of Medea with witchcraft has been established by tragic tradition. And here I start to give a little bit of context about where Euripides sits in amongst other tragedians, to kind of flesh out what kind of evidence we're dealing with, what time Euripides is writing in, and what that theme of witchcraft means in that particular period. So whereas in a written essay for a module, you don't get a lot of marks for giving context because they expect you to know the context from the lectures, in a dissertation there's a little bit more room for that, and actually that shows that you've developed an assured understanding of the topic. You're the expert when you're writing your dissertation, and that's the way to start to view yourself as you write. You are the expert on the topic. Paragraph 4, and again I'm not recommending a certain number of paragraphs, but I'm giving you the case by case of how you focus in from that original hook into the crux of the argument. And here I start to set up the debate. So whilst many scholars refute Medea's appearance as a witch in Euripides' Medea, etc, etc, etc. And notice the way that I've structured my introduction. Primary evidence, ancient sources, things from the time, so my Euripides comes first. Secondary opinion, modern scholars' views on that text, modern scholars' views on that work, the debate comes second. And that shows that you understand the difference between the two. It also allows you to appraise the primary evidence in light of all the secondary that you've read. So structurally, that is good practice. That's a good thing to do. So this is what the next paragraph covers. Any kind of scholarly debate on Medea as a witch, people, arguing about whether she's classed as a witch or not. And that's something to unpack a bit in the introduction and take a stance on. Okay? And then I kind of rinse and repeat, because my dissertation was comparative. And if you are a joint honours person and you're thinking of doing a comparative dissertation, bear that in mind. So my next paragraph does the same thing for Shakespeare. Okay, so the last couple of paragraphs in the introduction really assert what I'm going to be focusing on and what I'm going to be looking at. So these are setting out, I suppose, a methodology. Now, methodology might be something you forgot about, but you covered in GCSE science. So how are you going to conduct the research that you are going to conduct? It's something you perhaps did with scientific experiments at school. So it's telling the reader what you're going to do explicitly. If you're a linguist, It might be the case that you're going to have particular keywords and you're going to be looking up this Latin keyword across different texts, the way it's used in different periods. If you're not a linguist, if you're working in translation, maybe your methodology is, hey, I'm going to compare translations of this ancient text to see how it was received differently over time. If you're a historian, it might be the case that you have to appraise different types of evidence and you've got good reason for selecting that evidence. So maybe you're focusing in on it because it tells you the most about that period, because it's the most reliable, and you're excluding other things because they're less reliable. So maybe you focus in on artefacts that were excavated in a particular period because artefacts that were excavated in the 1800s or whatever were compromised. I don't know, I'm not really a great archaeologist, but that's just a for instance. Tell the reader exactly what you're going to do. Okay, so here I've promised to focus the study on performative representations of witches. So my methodology is looking at the mechanics of how they appeared on stage, not just what they say, what props would be available, etc., etc. And you can see how you've made your dissertation even more focused by limiting your research to a particular method. What you're going to look at, why. Okay? And so the next thing to think about is setting up the structure of the dissertation. You might not quite be there yet, but hopefully you will get there before Christmas. So in the last video I mentioned you can set up a contents page, and it's more or less the first thing that I did. I set up a really provisional one based on my crazy spider diagrams at the start of the year, and then when you start to write your dissertation introduction, you set up that structure and justify it. Okay, and this is a good way actually of doing due diligence, because you're checking that the structure of your plan is really going to work. So if we have a look at mine, in order to study how the treatment of witchcraft shaped the reception of these plays, this study will examine each tragedy thematically. So that's the way that I split my chapters up. I'm telling the reader that I'm going by theme, and then the fourth chapter will. You can see that I've set out the sequence. So it's just a bigger scale version of doing what you do already in 2,000 word essays. You're setting up your sat-nav and you're telling the reader exactly where you're going to go. What has everyone else had to say about this? Where do you fit in? So for me, although scholarship has treated the significance of witchcraft in these plays respectively, and at times made really fleeting comparisons, some people do compare them such as a sentence, there is no extensive typological comparison of the two. So I'm committing a huge word count to comparing the two, which is something that other people haven't done yet. Final paragraph. Many things in between might be quite different, but this is the kind of hammer home paragraph that you have to draw your dissertation introduction to a close. So therefore, I will conclude my dissertation by considering how the treatment of witchcraft influenced both Euripides' defeat, finishing third at the Dionysia, and Shakespeare's retention of patronage, where the tragedy Gowrie had been banned for directly treating a recent use of magic in political conspiracy. Whew, I actually think that sentence is too long looking back on it now. But it tells you kind of where the dissertation is going to come to a close and what I'm measuring the text against. So what's the point of the comparison? What am I hoping to establish overall through the methodology that I've set out? And then by examining, a lovely by examining sentence, I quite like these things, what's it going to allow me to do? So it's the so what test. You get to the end of an introduction, you get to the end of a paragraph and you ask yourself, so what? Who cares? What's the point? So what are we going to find out? So by examining the similarities and differences in these presentations of witches and considering how this affected each play's reception, needs an apostrophe, we can begin to understand how witches as mythical constructs assume social and political significance on the tragic stage. Okay, hope that's been helpful for you. And we can look more into how to structure individual chapters and conclusions further down the line. I'm just quite keen for the videos to link in with what stage you're at, because if you panic and watch every video you can possibly see on dissertations right now, you'll lose all sense of what your timeline is and where you should really be. Okay, So if you're starting your dissertation now, if you're thinking about a dissertation for next year and there's anything I've not mentioned that you want advice on, please leave a comment below. And until then, don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and share this with friends. I'm sure that some of these videos might be helpful if you're not an ancient historian or a classicist, but after surviving semester 1, I expect they'll get more content based. Okay? So I'll see you guys next time for some work on first and second year essays and things that are other than dissertation. So things like jumping a grade boundary and such as that. Okay, good luck and let me know how you get on.